Welcome and thanks to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm Garrett Felber. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Mississippi and one of the organizers of Study and Struggle. I'll be moderating tonight's conversation, Abolition as Study and Deconstructing Racial Capitalism, which is the first of 4 critical conversations this fall hosted by Haymarket Books. To see our future schedule and access events such as tonight after they've aired, you can visit our website, studyandstruggle.com, and click the Webinars tab. Study and Struggle is intended to connect and build radical community across boundaries, whether they be national borders or prison walls. Our 4-month curriculum was produced by a team of scholars, community organizers, and currently and formerly incarcerated people, including 2 of our panelists tonight, Rukia Lumumba and Stevie Wilson. It centers the interrelationship between prison abolition and immigrant justice, with a particular focus on the histories and ongoing freedom struggles in Mississippi and the South. We currently have over 100 reading groups around the world, a dozen of which are in prisons in Mississippi. And we hope that these groups become radical communities unto themselves, which are connected to one another through our Pen Pal program and to our larger community, which when we come together once a month for conversations like these. Our critical conversations will discuss the key concepts for the upcoming month, and we're absolutely thrilled to have such a fantastic group of organizers tonight to launch our inaugural program. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to thank the organizers and sponsors of this conversation, our entire Study and Struggle team, and Haymarket Books. It's critical that we support independent publishers and grassroots organizations during this time, and you can do that in a couple of ways. First, by buying books from Haymarket and joining the Haymarket Book Club. Second, by supporting the dozen of Study and Struggle groups outside Mississippi which have indicated financial need through our GoFundMe, which will be linked in the chat. And finally, if you're in a position to make a donation, no matter how small, via Venmo, there will be a card on the screen about how to do this, and folks posting that information in the YouTube chat as well. All donations from tonight's event, including the registration donation that you may have already made, will go to the Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition, which is working to decarcerate, provide support to formerly incarcerated people, and shut down Parchment Prison. This video will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel as well as our website. Please subscribe to the Haymarket channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. I also want to let everyone know about an upcoming event in the Haymarket livestream series. Tomorrow night, please join us for Unforgetting Family, Migration, Gangs, Borders, and Revolution with Roberto Lovato and Mike Davis. You can register for these upcoming events on Eventbrite, and the links to sign up are being posted in the chat. A few housekeeping items. For folks who want to follow the chat, we suggest you use the top chat option rather than the live chat. If you're following along on social media tonight, please use hashtag #StudyAndStruggle. People who violate our community guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. With so many people joining this call, we may need your patience if we have any technical issues. If your stream gets choppy, it might be helpful to reduce your image quality. Folks will give you instructions on how to do so in the chat. If our YouTube feed is interrupted for any reason, you may need to navigate back to the YouTube Haymarket Books page. The feed should resume there in case of interruption. This event will have live closed captions. To enable those, please click the CC button on the bottom of the video. If you're having any trouble with the closed captions, there will be a link in the chat to the raw caption feed for deaf and hard of hearing folks. We're incredibly grateful to have our interpreter and captioning team supporting us tonight, and to HEARD for developing tonight's accessibility strategy. HEARD is an abolitionist organization that supports deaf and disabled communities impacted by the carceral system, which includes supporting the work of language justice. Tonight we have live captioning in English and Spanish, and a new deaf-centered model of ASL interpretation that inverts the power dynamics found in typical hearing-centered models of interpreting. To support HEARD's work, please see the donation link in the chat. We should have some time at the end for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our wonderful speakers tonight and begin our program. Rachel Herzing is the executive director of the Center for Political Education, a resource for political organizations on the left, progressive social movements, the working class, and people of color. Rachel has played roles as an organizer, activist, and advocate, fighting the violence of policing and imprisonment. Jericho Purnell is a human rights lawyer, writer, and organizer. Since graduating from Harvard Law School, she has worked to end police and prison violence nationwide by providing legal assistance, research, and trainings to community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. Jericho is currently a columnist at The Guardian and deputy director of the Spirit of Justice Center at Union Theological Seminary. Stephen Wilson is a currently incarcerated Black queer writer, activist, and student. For over 2 decades, he was active in the ballroom community and worked as an HIV prevention specialist and community organizer. His work and practice inherit teachings from prison abolition, transformative and racial justice, Black feminist theory, and gender and queer liberation. Stevie is currently doing 30 days of solitary confinement as an act of retaliation by the prison. So I hope that you'll bear with us this evening as we patch together a combination of phone recordings and previous interviews with Stevie in response to the themes for this conversation. It's crucial that incarcerated people be centered in conversations about abolition, so we appreciate your flexibility as we try out this format. Since this event will be transcribed and sent to all of our inside study groups, I also want to take a moment to say to our incarcerated comrades, we love you, we are studying and fighting with you, and you are here with us tonight. We'll also have a slide with Stevie's address during the conversation, and I know he'd love to hear from all of you out there, so please consider sending him a letter of support. And last, certainly not least, Rukia Lumumba is the executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute, co-lead of the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives, and a steering committee member and co-chair of the legal committee of the Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition. She was also a co-producer of the incredible Black National Convention this last weekend, which I believe is still available to watch online if you missed it. And Rukia is one of our dear comrades in Study and Struggle as well, and we're so grateful to have her with us tonight. So we'll begin this evening, as we do in all of our conversations, by hearing from one of our Mississippi partners. So Rukia will start by sharing a bit about the Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition and their work in the state, and then we'll move on to the Q&A format.
Hey everybody, thank you Garrett, thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone who's listening tonight, who's tuning in. Sincere thanks and appreciation to all of our loved ones and all of our folks inside, our friends, our family that are inside, behind cages. Thank you for letting all of us out here fight with you, fight for you in this struggle. Just sincere thanks and big appreciation to the entire team at the Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition. Again, my name is Rukia Lumumba. I am very thankful to be here tonight to share a little bit about the work we're doing here in Mississippi. Mississippi has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And on December 29th, 2019, people incarcerated inside of Parchment Penitentiary and other Mississippi Department of Correction prisons led an uprising, exposing horrific conditions and treatment inside of prisons. Weeks later, the Department of Justice opened an investigation into Parchment Penitentiary and several other Mississippi prisons. But the COVID-19 pandemic halted the investigation, resulting in continued abuse and neglect. In the last 6 months, 59 incarcerated people have died. There have been 382 confirmed COVID cases that we know of. And to make matters worse, Governor Tate Reeves of the state of Mississippi vetoed life-saving parole reform. The Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition was reactivated in January of 2020 and resulting directly from the uprising of our folks inside. It is a group made up of incarcerated, formerly incarcerated people, families with loved ones that are currently incarcerated, advocacy organizations, and concerned residents demanding that the state of Mississippi immediately reduce the prison population, remove harmful conditions and policies that are harming our folks on the inside, and restore humanity by closing Parchment Prison completely. Immediately, we are asking that the Mississippi legislature override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 2123. So we're asking everyone who's listening tonight to please take this call of action with us and call Mississippi state legislators and demand that they override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 2123, which would have provided life-saving parole reform to many people currently incarcerated in Mississippi. I thank you all again for this opportunity, and I look forward to continuing the conversation tonight. Thank you again, Garrett, and the entire Study and Struggle community.
Thank you, Rukia. So we're going to begin our discussion portion, and I'm going to have each of the panelists begin by sort of self-introducing your work through study, what role study has played in your journey to abolition. And we're going to begin with Stevie. He was able to record a clip this last weekend talking about the importance of study for him with a comrade. So we'll start with that clip number one, John.
All right, this is Stevie, and first I want to thank Garrett and my fellow panelists for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this event. Unfortunately, I can't speak live, so I'm going to record something about study and its importance, and particularly it's been important to me because it's changed my life. I know that for me, studying was a way for me to figure out what was happening in my world, what had happened in my community, and it gave me a way to also figure out how to change things for the better. And I know that it's something that continues for us. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a one-place thing. And for us here, we study with a purpose, and it's a transformation of ourselves, and then so that we'll be able to transform ourselves, our environment, our relations with other people. And study for us doesn't occur just inside of a classroom. But we always say it happens collectively, though. We believe that it happens collectively. You can't study just by yourself. You have to be engaged with other people or with other texts. And so we believe that study has to be a collective thing. We also believe, once again, the purpose of it is to better yourself so that you as a person and your relationships with other people and your environment becomes better. And that's important. It's something also that will not take place inside of these prisons if we don't do it, because the Department of Corrections does not want us to study. The Department of Corrections does not want us to get better. And so if we want to do better and be better, we have to study. And it's important for us to study the history. People came before us. Too often we found ourselves trying to reinvent the wheel. People had already done things and we could learn from them, but we didn't have the materials to know that. We didn't have the information to know that. And so now, with the help of many people from outside, we're able to get materials of what had happened in the past and what's happening today. And this knowledge empowers us, and we're able to learn from past movements, past situations, people who've been locked up before us, and what they have done and what they've been able to accomplish, and where they failed, and how we can actually attach ourselves to the work they've been doing and extend it, and people will come after us. So study has been a major activity for us, and it's been a major vehicle of transformation. And so I think it's important for all of us inside to take the time to study, to take the time to better ourselves, and emphasize the point that it cannot be done without the help of people beyond these walls, outside the walls, because the Department of Corrections, no matter where you have 1 minute left, whether it's California, whether it's Pennsylvania, whether it's South Carolina, they don't want us to study. So please stay connected to people and help us study. Thank you.
So if we could start, I think with you, Rachel, any responses to Stevie and sort of an introduction to your own life's work as it relates to study and abolition.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. this afternoon. And thank you also to everybody who's participating in study and struggle inside and outside of prisons. I would agree with Stevie that I think study is a very important tool, not only to kind of dealing with our own conditions, but also for us to build community with each other. And I would also agree that it is best not done alone. I direct an organization that is dedicated to working with other organizations and movements in order to use study as a tool for strengthening their work. So from that perspective, I think we would take an approach to the idea of prison industrial complex abolition, which is the kind of abolition I'll be talking about tonight. We would take that approach that says that study that acknowledges the central role that study plays, no matter how well we do it, won't eliminate the prison industrial complex. So I'm going to say that a slightly different way because I said it in a complicated way. No matter how good we are at studying alone is not going to abolish the prison industrial complex. I think our orientation is more that study is essential to organizing for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. And we need study to organize well. So I happen to be an overeducated person who has had the benefit of lots of formal education. And I'm also someone who's benefited from very good movement education. I'm not a fan, however, of study for its own sake. I think our best education is put in service of making change. So that change might be a change in our own conditions. We might need a GED to get a job, or we might need to be able to read to fill out a housing application or to apply for benefits. But if we're talking about study for prison industrial complex abolition, then our study needs to be in service of fundamentally transforming the conditions that sustain surveillance, policing, sentencing, imprisonment, and execution. Our study has to be put to work. So I'm not sure what I think about the frame of study, abolition as study, and that didn't make a ton of sense to me. I think I might say study for abolition or study for struggle, so that we never lose track of the fact that change is our ultimate goal and not study for the sake of study.
Thank you, Rachel. Jericho, do you want to introduce yourself and your work through kind of your experience with study? And
Sure. Thank you again for the invitation, Garrett. It's so good to see you again, even though not in the flesh. Hi, Ricky. Ricky, I don't think I have seen you since I've seen Garrett in Mississippi. It was ages ago. And Rachel, I'm so lucky the last person I saw. The last time I flew in Miami, had I known that would have been the last time I would have hugged you tighter. So thank you so much again for the invitation. One thing that Stevie said that really stood out to me is that studying helps you become a better person, it helps you develop better relationships, and it helps you develop a greater sense of yourself to the environment. So sort of this three-pronged approach to how he and his comrades take on study. And it actually reminded me of when I was in law school. And I mean, most of my organizing has been through student organizing. I mean, way back in high school, the student sit-ins, the walkouts, like all of that was so much a part of my life. And I was a student organizer through college, but it wasn't actually until law school where I started to become politicized around political education. I hadn't heard this phrase. The first person I heard it said was Robin Kelly. And I was like, okay, so what's the political education list? Like, what's the political education starter kit? What do I need to read? And Robin said, well, I can't tell you what to read for your political education. You have to get with some people and decide what political education makes sense for your struggle. And I was like, so first you tell me that political education exists, but you're not even going to tell me how to use it, what to do with it. I got to figure that out. But I'm so happy that I was a part of a student movement with people who had politics much further left than mine at the time, with people who were politicized through other movements, who knew that study was a part of their experiences. But most of us were not there. Most of us were not there. If anything, we thought that our organizing demands were just the right thing. We figured we were smart enough. We figured we were nice enough. We figured that we were kind enough and curious enough. And our demands, they were just the right thing to do. I mean, why wouldn't Harvard Law School want to hire a diversity, access, and inclusion officer? Why wouldn't they want to hire more Black staff? And it wasn't until I went to South Africa and there were students who were organizing around their flawless movements. And they were literally reading and then sitting down and having plenary and making real-time decisions based on what they were reading. And I was like, oh, I think maybe this is what Robin may be talking about. It was the first time I was seeing study and struggle part of the same space. And so when I went back to school from that study abroad research project, we started reading. We developed a reading list with the help of a dream defender at the time. I can't remember her first name. I think her name was also Rakia, if I need to double check. So we created a reading list. We read books. The first thing we read was an essay that Robin Kelly wrote, since he inspired us to think more critically about this. And long story short, we ended up throwing our demands away. We said these demands are trash. You know, it wasn't enough to be good or to be nice or to be kind or to have ideas that made sense. We needed a political analysis. We needed to call it to question the role that Harvard was playing in society. We need to call into question that Harvard was playing in the community of Cambridge and in Boston. We needed to call into question our relationship to the institution as students, as Black students, as queer students, as students from poor and impoverished and class exploited backgrounds. Our entire analysis shifted. So we went from wanting a critical race theory program to implementing our own critical race theory program and inviting critical race theories. And we ultimately created the only space on campus where anyone could teach. It didn't matter if you were part of the dining services team, custodial worker, if you were a student, if you were a clinical faculty. We created the environment that we thought that we could just convince Harvard to become. And that was so transformative for me. And so now when I talk to law students, I try to say, yes, it's important you learn constitutional law, I guess. The Constitution is important. That's what you're supposed to graduate law school trying to defend. But the most important thing you can do is find your people and start to cultivate a political analysis. Because what you think may be good or may feel intuitive, you've been socialized to believe that. And now you have to do the deep work of critically rethinking all of what made you possible and to do that with other people. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jericho. Rakia, take us through your journey a bit.
So, I first of all, I just have to say thank you for this panel, because honestly, like Rachel, and I just truly just have followed your work for a very long time, and just like you are one of our guides in this movement, and just really grateful for you. And then Jericho, I just love all that you're doing, and I appreciate you. And Garrett, thank you for continuing to center Mississippi. Oftentimes we don't have that, and so I really appreciate that. So for me, I grew up in an activist, Black nationalist household. And, so my parents were intentional about letting us learn on our own, as opposed to forcing material on us. But I had a privileged experience around academia, around study, in terms of just being able to sit and overhear conversations about particular books and about strategies and theories and this, that, and the third. And so I recognize that. And so I come into this work having grew up and literally from in the womb, like hearing these things over and over and over again. So to some extent, I don't know what it is to be without having some type of analysis around our freedom and around abolition and around what that kind of looks like. And that's just my reality. But I think what always struck me and was my biggest concern, and continues to be my concern, is our ability, including my own ability, to study, to recognize the struggle and be in it, and then to act, right? To experiment. And oftentimes, for me, it's that action and that experimentation, and then continued study, like realizing it's a circular process that we have to actually experiment and continue to study at the same time. Yeah. That I'm still trying to push myself to consistently do. And so, that's the challenge that I often talk about with others is how do we create or begin to really lay the foundation for the transformative systems that we want to see in the future, for our view of what abolition may look like in our future, if we don't just go ahead and jump out there and do it and experiment a little bit. And so for me, the purpose of study has become the purpose of actually also experimenting. So like taking that journey. And so, this conversation is really rich for me right now, because it is further making me challenge that notion and really engage deeper in study with a recommitment to engage deeper in study with our community as well, here in Jackson, around how do we engage in that study in ways where everybody feels that the information is accessible. How do we, do huge film screenings of books that we're reading, right, to make it accessible for folks who aren't going to be able to sit down and read a 400-page book, in a month or so, right? Because literally they're tired after getting off of work, or for a myriad of other reasons, right? Literacy rate in Mississippi the illiteracy rate in Mississippi is super high. And how do we actually decrease that and do something like Cuba did with the Literacy Project, right? Like, how do we begin to make it more accessible for our folks? I'm going off into a tangent, so I'm going to slow down and I'm going to stop now. But for me, the study piece is about sharing that study process with community, making it more accessible, and then experimentation. And so, Thank you.
Thank you, Rukia. So I think we're going to hear another clip from Stevie that I think speaks a little bit to Derica's point about kind of wanting the desire when you hear about political education for a blueprint. So Stevie's going to lay out some of the different groups that he participates in inside. And this is from an interview that he did on Abolitionist study with Rust Belt Abolition Radio in Michigan. So I want to give them a shout out for letting us use this clip. But I would love to hear from all of you a little bit about some of the nitty gritty of how you've structured study groups, not just what you read, but how were you in community? What were the ways that you sort of got, to these issues of access, of building community through study? So we'll listen to that clip first. And this is clip number 2.
So tell us a little bit more about these abolition study groups inside that you help run. Can you tell us more about what you'll do? And yeah.
Okay. Well, the first one was called 9971, obviously references to Attica, and it was a general abolition study group. We started with something like Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, and what we would do a chapter reading, and then we would come back and we have discussion questions. We focus a lot on definitions because this is the first time many people were hearing about abolition. When you say we're with our prison, they thought we were crazy. The first thing could in their mind, what are you going to do with the murderers and the rapists and things like that? And so we had to really talk about basic definitions and things like safety and community and things like that. So that was the largest group because it was more generalized. We also had a group called Circle Up, which is a transformative justice group. Most of the men there were under the age of 25, about 23 young men, and they were doing a program called Circle Up, and they were talking about transformative justice, how we apply it inside the prison and in our families, in our communities. SAS was the pre-abolitionist group, and that was because that group we started because it was sometimes difficult to talk about those type of issues in 9971. All right, so we had a group that went through Cap and Genders and Career Injustice and works like this from an abolitionist perspective. And then we also had a Bow Type Books book club, which 10 prisoners were involved in, and Bow Type Books, which used to be Nations Book, would send in a book each month with some discussion questions, and we would meet. It's like a book club. That has been taken over by Haymarket Books now. So here at Smith, at Fayette, we're going to be doing it, and Haymarket Books will be providing the books for us. So we're happy to have that program still continue.
That's awesome. I mean, can you tell us more about?
So, Rachel, we'll start back with you again. I guess just returning to this question about how you structure study through the Center for Political Education, and maybe if you would speak to also something that you touched upon in your previous remarks about how we're not talking about neutral study. We're talking about something that's used to build power. So how do we use study as a way to build power?
Yeah, I think, a lot of what Stevie laid out in his response are also things that I've experienced over my time in organizations doing political education, but also that we use at the Center for Political Education as well. Developing shared language, I think, is really, really crucial. And that's not to tell everybody that you have to speak exactly the same way, but I do think that it matters that there's a shared understanding of what we're getting at. And that also there's an acknowledgement that the language that we use has power, but also can do certain kinds of work. So as one little example of that Derica has been abused by me recently around is, I want everybody to stop using the word officer in reference to COs and in reference to cops. They do not deserve that kind of deference. So do not call them an officer, but to understand the political nature of that language, right? Or to understand that everything is not everything when it comes to abolition, but there are very specific kinds of politics that entails. And so I appreciate Stevie raising that. And I want to come back also to something that Rukia mentioned that I think is really, really important. I was grateful that you brought it up, Rukia, which is experimentation, right? So if we are developing a praxis, if we're studying and then applying and studying and applying, our practice gets better, but also our analysis gets better. And kind of moving back and forth, I think, and understanding that what we learn is only as useful as what we are able to make it do, and that what we do has to be informed by an understanding of what's possible. And I don't mean like what the state tells us is possible, but I mean like developing a hypothesis about the conditions that we're living under and where we want to go, and having that inform rather than, as Derica was saying, we're just good kids with good ideas, right? So we do study at the Center for Political Education in a bunch of different ways. We do some formal study groups, like read a thing, discuss it, watch a thing, discuss it. We do some classes where, like Derica recently came to a class that we held, where there's a curriculum and we, spend time trying to go over core concepts and we have guest speakers. We also do things that are a little different. So we'll show films, or we'll bring together organizations to be in strategic conversation together. And to my mind, those conversations are also places where political education happens, because we're having to articulate what we think, we're hearing from others. Hopefully, we're engaging in principled struggle, and that makes us fight smarter, I think, which to my mind is the goal. I want everybody to get more of what we want and need, and so we need to fight as smart as possible to be able to do that. The last thing I think I'll say about that is that I think that there's a way that, I don't know, like back and forth study that I've done with people inside also has been through maybe correspondence or maybe through phone calls or something like that. And some of that has been, we read something together and we discuss it, some of the way that Stevie was describing. Also just been like, I think this thing. Tell me what you think about that. And I do think that having conversations with people with whom you are either already politically engaged or you'd like to be politically engaged goes a very, very long way for some of the reasons I was talking about before. So I'll leave it there. That might not be quite as nitty gritty as you hoped, but I bet Rukia and Jericho both have really good things to say about that too.
All right, Jericho, you have to get nittier and grittier then. It's on you.
Nittier and grittier. Okay, well, I'm wearing my Advancement Project t-shirt because when I got out of law school, I told you I became like a political education zealot. I said, oh, everyone has to go and know about this political education thing. We got to take this show on the road. And so my supervisor then, Thomas Miranda, who's good friends with Rachel, he said, okay, this is your first job out of law school. What's the plan? Like, what is it that you want to take on? And I said, political education. We have to do political education in the Justice Project to make sure that we have an analysis. And he was just like, what? It was so funny. But over time, I'm so grateful that he gave me space to do that, not only at Advancement Project, but with my partner site. And so I'm born and raised in St. Louis. I'm from St. Louis. I consider it my hometown, very proud of it. And I had a chance through Advancement Project to go back to St. Louis to work with organizers there, and through Action St. Louis on the Close to Workhouse campaign around Bye Bob, and then with the Ferguson Collaborative on the Department of Justice consent decree with the Ferguson Police Department. And one of the first things that we did was political education. Because if we're going to work towards building a campaign, the number one question, how do we know that where is our political commitments? Where are our principles? What is our shared vocabulary? So when I started talking about abolition, and everybody was like, whoa, pump the brakes, what are you talking about? It's like, oh yeah, we probably should read and talk to some people. And so one of the first things that we did in Ferguson was read a book about policing. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, if we're going to have a consent decree whose primary purpose is going to attempt to improve the police department, and the people in this room, the organizers in this room, have a spectrum of what they believe about policing. You have people who want community policing, whatever that means, and you have people who are abolitionists. And so how do we start developing an analysis to figure out how to approach this consent decree? And ultimately, we decided to focus on parts of the consent decree, after our political education, parts of the consent decree that removed harm from people who lived in Ferguson. So we focus on getting cases dismissed, for example. We focus on having, fewer interactions between police officers and civilians. We focus on giving feedback on the use of force policies within the police department to, increase the number of touches, that they could not do when they came into the police counter. So we started to mold and shape our analysis around the institution of policing. And then that helped inform our organizing. But Close the Workhouse, the very first political education conversation that we had was around abolition. And it was because people who were a part of the campaign really loved and, just had such a special place in their heart for the work that Access St. Louis was doing, but weren't quite convinced that we could close the jail. And so the first session that we did was, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? And we put scenarios all across the wall, and we just walked through each one of those scenarios. And then not only did we ask questions like, what about the murderers and what about the rapists? I asked people in that room, why do people kill people? Why do people kill people? Because what about the murderers doesn't even get to the heart often what people are afraid of. So then we came up with these grand lists of why people kill people. And then we talked about ways to prevent that or ways to respond after it happened. And so from that campaign, having a group of people who were half skeptical about the project of abolition, half curious, to them being a fully fledged abolitionist campaign that ultimately closed down that jail, it felt like one of the most exciting things that has ever happened to me, probably anyone in that organization. And so there was a lot of debate, a lot of confusion initially, a lot of concern about safety and about whether this was feasible, was it possible? And now that jail is closed because of political education, because of experimentation, and because people who were formerly incarcerated there and people who were committed to its destruction did all of that to make sure it closed down. And so I hope that's nitty gritty enough. I'm trying to think, is there any more? I think that's the nitty. Is no real dirt there, no drama, but that's hopefully that helps.
Yeah, Rukia, go ahead. That was great. Thank you so much, Jericho.
Yeah, sorry. That was great. Thank you. It actually made me think of, the work that we're doing, because we really want to see Parchment Prison closed down, and with the Mississippi Prison Reform Coalition, that's our goal, and then to attack all the other prisons. But I think that, the process that Jericho talked about is really important. And when we look at the demand for Parchment to close, it comes from a similar process of folks inside and folks outside really studying the history of Parchment and understanding its existence as a place of torture and abuse for Black people since its inception. So Parchment Prison is an 18,000-acre plantation in Mississippi, similar to Angola Prison in Louisiana, which is also an 18,000-acre plantation. But Parchment, before Reconstruction, served as a plantation. It served as an institution of slavery. Immediately after Reconstruction, it was turned into a workhouse and a prison. And it has existed as a prison ever since. The last time, in studying Parchment, and really a lot of our study has come from guidance from folks inside, looking at the space that we used to have our meetings, our regular meetings around public safety inside of the COFO building here in Mississippi, which is a building that was erected to honor the coalition of civil rights groups that came together to really create some serious change in Mississippi. And so we used to meet in there, and inside of there are like these murals that honor the work that had happened in the past. And so one of the first murals that you see is this mural of Parchment Prison. And it's a mural that shows an article that indicates how, young folks primarily were incarcerated in Parchment Prison and suffered a lot of the similar abuses that folks are currently experiencing right now inside of Parchment Prison and other Mississippi prisons right now. And they were incarcerated because of their protests in the 1960s and 70s. And we're talking about abuses of not being allowed to shower, abuses of not being provided food, abuses of not having drinkable water. and not being given drinkable water. Abuses of sewage existing inside of the cage, inside of their cell. Conditions of denial of medical treatment, understaffing, and unqualified staff, right? These are literally exactly the same conditions of abuse that folks are currently expressing inside of Parchment and are being retaliated against, similar to our brother Stevie, who has been retaliated against for speaking out right now. And so I think, when talking about the intricacies of study, getting into the weeds of it, is that studying our experiences is also very important, and having those real conversations that Rachel talked about is critical as well. Because I think that exposes a lot sometimes. Last story I'll share too is the importance of allowing study to also be centered in people who are directly impacted by the harm we're trying to cure. One of the things I learned throughout my time growing up here in Mississippi is that oftentimes as advocates, we think we know the answer because we know where we want to go, right? But what I've experienced is that when we stop and just listen, when we really just stop and listen to what people are saying they want, we actually began to realize that how we get to our North Star is not exactly the same way as we envision, because our people may not be right where we are at that time. So for example, we always give this example when talking about community-led governance, which I think is directly tied to abolition, right? Because and we can talk about that another time. But but when I think about this is, here in Jackson, we talk about potholes, right? Anybody who comes to Jackson, we got potholes. And when my father became mayor, he, used the People's Assembly format. My father, Chokwe Lumumba, he was the late mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, revolutionary human rights attorney, amazing human being, dedicated his life to all of the work that we're all doing right now. He, when creating his platform, actually, to run for mayor, he had a People's Assembly. And in the assembly, folks were like, yeah, man, you keep talking about this liberation, this freedom, this self-determination. But to be honest, I'm just concerned about my ability to get to work, because every time I ride down the road, I hit a pothole. And when I hit that pothole, it breaks my rim. And now I got to get my rim fixed, and I got to get a new tire. And now I'm late for work. And now for some folks, literally are now unemployed because they didn't get to work, right? And so we began to realize that we can't just move rapidly past the existing complexities that are causing the problems in the first place, that are preventing us from living our best lives, right? And so when we're talking about study, we gotta talk about study deeply about our own experiences and how we actually also use those experiences to chart the course for our journey towards abolition and our freedom. And so I hope that made sense and was clear. And if not, just ask me a follow-up question. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I love that story. And I think that's really actually segues us to the next clip from Stevie, because one of the things that he talks about a lot is translation. And in a letter to me recently, he wrote something that I thought was really heartbreaking, because we've talked a lot about translation. And he said to me, I don't actually like doing the work of translation inside. It's something I do out of necessity. He's talking about, taking texts and sort of breaking them down. And he said, I do that because the people inside are written about, and they can't access the way that they're being written about. And so he talks in this clip a little bit about the importance of translation, of accessibility of study. And the other thing he talks about is this idea of abolition as practice, not as a place that we're sort of working to, but something that is ongoing and in process. So we'll play that clip, and then you can sort of pick either of those questions of translation and accessibility or of abolitionist presence or praxis. So this is clip number 3, John.
Well, what I was trying to explain to people when I say abolition, and this is that's why I asked that question, because I want them to understand that abolition is not something that's always in the future. I was explaining to them that if someone, a white, wealthy person, right, breaks the law, okay, what's the chances of this person being put in prison? It's not going to happen. Say if this guy has a substance abuse problem, and this guy is 21 years old, he's white, he lives out in the suburbs, has a substance abuse problem, he breaks into his neighbor's house, burglarizes the house, and gets caught, and gets locked up. Are they going to keep him locked up? No, they're probably going to send him to some drug treatment place. That's what's going to happen. That's abolition. That's abolition. That's abolition. Instead of locking him up, we're going to see where you need to be, treatment. You see, and that is abolition also. So I'm trying to explain to people that, no, the solution isn't always called the police, it isn't always a jail or prison. There are other ways that we can deal with harm. And so when I explain it that way to them, then they see, oh, it's here. Abolition is here now, just that everyone doesn't get a chance to be a part of that process. How can we open it up to everybody? How can we open it up to the person is getting high and then they're committing crime to get high, then maybe we don't need to lock that person up. That's not the issue. We don't just call the police and lock them up. Maybe we just get them help with their substance abuse problem. And that's abolition. And so my task a lot of times in here is actually translating the work for the people in here. And that's one area I think that we're not doing too well in. I don't think we're doing too well in that area. Stuff that's actually being published, you understand what I'm saying? I don't think that it's actually accessible to a lot of people who are behind the walls.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to throw a curveball and start with Jericho. So Rachel doesn't always have to respond immediately.
Can you give me the question? Because that's a curveball. I'm not even on the field. What's the question?
No, that's the curveball. No, either, this question of what does abolitionist practice look like? So for people maybe who are new to abolition and think about it really as maybe this utopian location that we're working towards, how do we see abolition as something that we do in our daily lives? Or this question about translation, how do we make study accessible, and why does it matter who we study with, not just what we study?
Wow, okay. Translation or its practice. So I'll try the translation part. I'll attempt it because I try to think of myself as a writer, and sometimes I get things wrong and things are lost in translation a lot. One thing that I really wish I had not written in the piece I wrote for The Atlantic called How I Became an Abolitionist was this part where I talked about when I first heard the word abolition, and I said it felt white and utopic. And ever since then, I've been reading more about utopia and socialist utopia, and I reread Freedom Dream since then. And I was just like, no, I wasn't trying to be critical of utopia. We need utopias. We need to think and dream and imagine new ways of being. And I shouldn't have been I wasn't intentionally being dismissive when I wrote that. I was trying to speak to a way that a lot of people also feel similarly about abolition when they first hear it, that it's this utopic idea, without actually understanding the importance of utopias. The same way that people dismiss anarchy right now, it's just, anarchy, without actually grappling with the politics of what anarchy is. And so I don't want to give utopia a bad rep, because we need utopia so much to help and guide our work. And so I think that translation is important. One thing that came up in Stevie's comments that I am excited that it's a debate within the abolitionist community. I don't know which community it is, but it's a debate that I'm hearing right now. And I'm figuring out sort of how to think about it. And so it's what abolition is and what abolition is not. And so there was this piece that came out sometime this summer critiquing the idea that abolition is the suburbs, right? And then to hear Stevie say, well, abolition is someone in the suburbs getting treatment and not going to jail. And then thinking about Maya Schwimwar's new book that's critical of mandatory treatment for people who need help. So there are all these conversations and disagreements happening among abolitionists or people who study the politics. And I think that's really exciting because so often the conversation is, are you a reformer? Are you an abolitionist? Are you super, super, super woke TM? Or are you trying to undermine the system and support the man? What I'm actually more excited about in terms of the translation are the strands of disagreement and discourse and debate that's happening around these set of politics. Community policing is another one. There are people who consider themselves to be abolitionists who are excited, not community policing, community control of police, which is not community policing. I saw Rakia's face. No. Just in case, no, not that. There's a debate happening about whether community control of police is abolitionist. And I believe there was a paper that I actually still need to read saying that, no, it is not abolitionist. So these debates about the future that we're trying to build, the future that exists right now, I think that's really exciting. One thing that I say to the community control of police is abolitionists is that there are already communities in control of police. There are lots of communities in control of police right now. And if you say, well, those are just white communities, you can go to any of the countries in Latin America. You can go to a lot of the countries in Africa. There are systems of oppression that fall along racial lines. So it's not as simple as we just need people of color to be in charge of police in order to salvage the institution. And so I am excited about those debates that are happening. I feel like I'm not exactly answering your question, but that's why I was excited to share, listening to Stevie and now thinking about, what excites me about the conversation. And I hope that people continue to disagree and to push, because the other side of political education is not that we're all agreeing, right? There was a class that I took this summer with the People's Forum, and I took it with Dream Defenders, the Afro Socialist Caucus of DSA, and FemPower. And one thing that the instructor said is that we are here to build conceptual alignment as organizers. That's what we're here to do. That didn't mean agreement. It didn't mean that we all had to think the same thing. Is that we need to build conceptual alignment. So as our movements build power, we understand where we're coming from and how to relate to each other as organizations. So part of that political education, but especially around abolition, but for so many other areas of struggle and political ideology, is the need for conceptual alignment and not total agreement. And I'm happy that people are taking principled disagreement stances and saying, no, they're laying claim to contest it. So I'm excited about that.
Okay, I'm gonna take a brief 5 seconds just for the translation team to catch up. And now, Rukia, I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just am looking at our translation team and want to make sure that they're ready for us. So, thank you, Derica, because so I'm going to answer your question, but I also just want to just agree with Derica around, having police of color, having Black police does not mean that it's better policing. Or having police that come from your community does not mean that the system of policing is now better, right? We can look even at Jackson, Mississippi. We are an 85% Black city with over 90% of the police force is Black. And we still have police violence. right? So the system of policing itself is something that we're looking at. It's not about if the faces are black or white or brown or red. It's about a system that is actually inherently ineffective and does not protect our communities. And so, just thank you, Jericho. And it's similar to the whole conversation around correctional officers and the system of prisons, right? Rachel had mentioned earlier, like, we need to stop giving them the power of calling them officers. And I do want to know, Rachel, what do you suggest we call them? Because I do want to stop giving them the leadership of calling them officers, and I do want to call them something else. My mentor over here, Denise Coleman, who has spent 38 years in prison, who recently got out 2 years ago, she calls them police. So sometimes I just get confused if she's talking about the police outside or the police inside, but she definitely calls them police, right? And so, like, I don't know if that, maybe that's the term we should be using, but I'm really open to learning and using the right terminology, because I think that's important. One of the things that Stevie mentioned in his talk was this idea around giving examples of what abolition is. And so, like, the example of, someone getting drug treatment instead of going to a prison is a form of abolition. For me, I really appreciated that comment, because I think that it's both translation and practice to some extent. And maybe I'm not answering the question right. But for me, it because a lot of my work is literally just organizing community around the idea of something different than what we're currently experiencing, and then providing those resources to help them make that a reality, is being able to help folks understand the words I'm using so that we have similar definitions and vision. And so, as much as it's true in the debate community around abolition, right, which oftentimes is made up of a lot of advocates who have been studying for a long time, the terminology and definition of terminology and accessibility of terminology is just as important in terms of our day-to-day organizing with folks. And so I think the way Stevie approached defining abolition, for me, was really helpful, because it gave me another way to explore, how do I express the work of abolition, right? Because it's true. It is creating something different that is not based on punishment. And so I'm not really answering the question, and I'm kind of like all in my thoughts about it as I'm talking. But I just want to hold on to that, because I do think that was an important comment. And Rachel will probably really answer the question for you. So throw it into Rachel. Sorry.
Empty promises is what I would call that, Rukia. So I'll start by saying, answering your question, Rukia, which is not, it's just what I say. And I think there are lots and lots of ways of transforming our language, right? So we don't all have to use different language, but the point for me is that it's important that we're mindful of whose language we're using and toward what ends, right? So I say guards and cops to make the distinction between people who police cages and people who police people outside of cages. But I think police works in both of those situations too. Some people like other kinds of things, that aren't even as genteel as guards and cops, right? But the point there, I think, is more about kind of what power, what deference are we giving them, whose language are we using there. I don't ever think calling anything correctional is appropriate, so that's a good reason to strike that one out. The same way that, I don't think it's appropriate to call people offenders, right? So again, it's like not to kind of censor everybody, but to put put a bug in your ear around, like, can we be more thoughtful about how we're communicating as part of our political study, but also as part of our political practice. Right? So maybe I'll talk more about practice. And I found myself having a similar reaction to Derica in terms of Stevie's example. And I wish that he were here because I would love to, be more engaged with him and to hear more about that idea. But I appreciate kind of where Rukia took that, because I do think that example it kind of takes us through translation and into practice, right? And I think now's an interesting period to be thinking about those kinds of examples. Like, what do we mean when we say alternatives to imprisonment, for instance? Because we're also in a period where we're being pressed to think about alternatives to the kinds of things that we use currently police for, right? And we know that all different things are not equal, and we know that they're not all good. So, for instance, just putting somebody in coercive treatment, that's locked down. It might be treatment, but it's still, if it's locked down, it's still locked down. Even if it's not locked down, if it's coercive, then it doesn't do the work, the abolitionist work that we hope life-affirming projects and services will do, which is to help people make the kinds of transitions that they want to make, to shift the kinds of conditions that lead people to engage in, behavior that some might call antisocial or some might call criminal or whatever, the stuff that Derica was getting at earlier. I would always rather see people who are seeking treatment get treatment rather than life in a cage. But I also want that treatment to not be debasing, or to not be physically harmful to them, or to not, I want it to be affirming, and I want it to be based on the kinds of goals that they set for themselves and they set for their loved ones. And I think that that's really what abolition is about. I think it's very popular these days to talk about abolition as an affirmative politics, and I agree that it is. I never want to lose sight of the fact that my ultimate goal is the elimination of the prison industrial complex, but at the same time, it is not only a negative politic. I think it is an affirmative politic. It's about how are we also creating the kinds of conditions that we want, that are important for us to have not just life, but beautiful, healthy, fulfilling life. That is impossible under the current conditions where we use the prison industrial complex as a response for everything from a cat in a tree to, crisis of homelessness, for instance. So the practice of that, to my mind, is really about that experimentation, to come back to experimentation, and for us to also be gracious with enough with each other to allow us time and space to experiment, and maybe even to fail at our experiment, but to try again, and not just say, well, abolition is a failed project because they couldn't get it right 100% the first time. And that practice, I think, is showing up and saying, this is what we actually want. This is what we think we need to be able to live well with each other and in right relation to the natural world. And we need time and space and knowledge to test that out. And so in the treatment example, what does life-affirming, self-determined, treatment that builds people's capacity to live well in relationship to other people in the natural world look like? Or what does, traffic direction that's not led by an armed agent of the state look like? So, I think there are lots of different ways that we can practice that. If I can say one more thing, I'm sorry to go on, but one other thing just popped into my brain that I think is another one of my little hobby horses. So I also think that that our abolitionist politics need to be aimed at changing all of our conditions. So I'm not particularly interested in kind of like everyday abolition. Like, I didn't punish my kids, so I'm an abolitionist because of this thing that I just said earlier, which is about the ultimate goal of eliminating the prison industrial complex, right? So if your act of not punishing your kids is attached to some bigger practice you're trying to build with parents kind of across your family or across your neighborhood or whatever that might be, to shift how your kids understand the nature of punishment, that's a very different thing than, I just did this one thing in my household, so now I'm good to go. Call me an abolitionist, right? Or I made a victory garden in my backyard and now we have a lot of pickles or something, But I mean, there's lots of different kinds of things that people are attributing abolitionist politics to. And I'm not trying to censor what people do or police what people do. But my question about that is, what are we building? What is the practice that we are developing such that we are absolutely able to eliminate the use of surveillance, policing, imprisonment, sentencing, and execution? What do we need to do? What kind of skills do we need to build over time? What relationships, what infrastructure do we need? And to my mind, all of those things together are the practice of doing abolitionist politics.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. I think that was great. We're getting a little tight on time, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'm going to move to a piece that Stevie recorded in June, kind of in response to the uprisings. And Rachel, you wrote a really powerful piece this summer, Political Education in a Time of Rebellion, that I thought was really timely. And you wrote, political education isn't just education about politics. It's education for the specific purpose of making our politics more powerful. It is frontline work. And I thought that was a really wonderful encapsulation of kind of the relationship between study and struggle in that moment. So we're going to play clip number 5, John, which is this recording of Stevie kind of talking about, I think, the promise of this historical moment of uprisings, as well as some fears. And he'll touch a little bit upon what you just did about everyone's an abolitionist now. And then we'll let you all have kind of closing statements.
So I'm thinking to myself, well, has he done any research? And I was reading a piece today from Dylan Rodriguez, and Dylan talks about how so many people today, particularly students, are claiming abolition, even though their politics and what they're calling for are not abolition. They're really anti-racist police reform or some kind of progressive decarceration where the deserving get out of prison, the other guys stay there because they're really bad guys. And we find that a lot of people think that they're upon abolition, but they're really not. Past is teaching them what abolition really is. And at the end, he says, you have to be willing to stand up and say, I'm abolitionist, and say that to Sojourner Truth's ghost. Say that to her ghost. Can you actually stand in front of them and the people who've laid down their lives for this and done this and say, look, I'm abolitionist? Can you really look at them and say that? You know what I mean? What you're calling for? It's amazing to me. It's just amazing. Only thing it takes some time to do with research. And I hope that I asked you guys, I asked people in Chicago also to get Miriam College piece, and so that we will understand that here's someone that we know who's an abolitionist, okay, and respected and known, and has done so much of the movement, and these are things we should not be supporting. And here we have somebody else coming out sideways saying, yeah, these things people want. Come on, who are we gonna listen to, Miriam or this guy? Who is this guy? You know what I mean? So it's just amazing to me how many people, and our biggest threat to what's happening right now are people coming into the movement and trying to co-opt it for their own personal reasons. Our biggest threat right now is people coming in and trying to redirect their energy towards non-reform reforms. Okay? People want something different right now. We need to make sure that they get something different. They want change. We need to make sure there is real change, and not just some other added measure where we're going to train police so they don't be as racist as they used to be. That's not going to work. The police are on the defensive, which is amazing to me because that's what we've been trying to do for a long time. So the narrative is that they don't create safety. They actually create harm. And people are seeing that, and this narrative is playing out all over the place now. And I just think we need to seize upon this also, because then we start talking about historically what are the role of police, right? I think about, okay, because the thing is that but people talk about, okay, defunding police is cool, but let's think about policing, period. And when you think about what policing is, period, we understand that we have to get rid of it. We need to get rid of it. That's the only real solution, okay? And so I think that when we start talking about policing and opening the conversation up with people saying, what is their role? What do they really do? And get people to understand that we don't need them. We can keep each other safe, okay? We can keep each other safe. We're not bringing us any safety. That's the thing that really is kind of like vexing me a little bit. It's just that I see all this energy and it's great. And it's actually, this thing is going further than I thought it would go right now. My major concern is that, we don't allow this to turn into a call for non-reform reforms. You don't take this energy and turn it, because people will be so disappointed. They're coming out every night, they're coming out every day, and they're protesting, and they're expecting some change, and all they get is some cosmetic, thing. Oh, yeah, we're going to get some more training, we're going to get some more body cams, we're going to do a national registry of events of assaults and stuff. Okay, that's good enough. No. People want real, deep, systemic change, and we have to keep pressing for that. We really do. And I also want people to connect what's happening out in the streets to what's happening inside these prisons, because if they're doing that out there with cameras and all that stuff, imagine what they're doing in here.
So, the following program.
So I'm thinking to myself, well, has he done? They're terrorizing us. They control us. Always put us in a situation where it's subhuman and dehumanizing us. And so we need to understand that it happens there and here. And I don't understand what people think, how people are going to end up behaving if you've been treated like this for 10 years and they let you out in the world. What do you think that person's going to behave like? They don't understand that. So it's a really it's a complex situation right now. And being in here and watching it, I'm full of hope that things will change. At the same time, I'm concerned that this energy doesn't get dissipated into some crazy non-change changes. I don't want to see that happen. Well, let's talk about policing, period. Let's take it one step further. We're talking about taking $1 billion away from their budget. Okay, well, let's talk about the role of policing, period. See? And we haven't really got to that conversation where we say, well, police are, because they have this thing, police brutality. Well, policing is always going to be brutal. It's violent work. You see what I'm saying? You can't make it nonviolent. There's no such thing as nonviolent policing. You know what I mean? And so we have to talk about what it is that they do. Not just the fact, okay, police are doing this, but what is it they do? The role that they play in our society. And we got to start questioning that and say, do we need this? Do we really need this? And who wants it? You know what I mean? It's really important. That's really important.
So we'll end with some time for closing comments from each of you about sort of to Stevie's point, where do you see us in this current moment in terms of both promise and possible pitfalls, and perhaps the importance of study in this current moment of uprisings. And then we'll move to our Q&A. And we'll start with you, Rachel.
All right. I'm in a really hopeful place right now in terms of the movement for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. I think there's a lot out there right now around which we should be pessimistic, and that's really hard and that people are struggling with. But I think the openings that we have right now to be able to try some different things out, which is all I mean when I'm talking about experiments, is the ability to try something new out that we haven't been given time to do before. And that there's more of an appetite for us to do this trying out than there may have been previously. And, that might just be my old, tired, behind, thinking about the 1990s and what things were like then or whatever. But I do think that there are some openings. I'm not naive, I think, about where we are and how much we're up against. But I do think that we need to take as much advantage of the windows that we have right now and try a bunch of stuff out, try as much stuff out as possible. I take Stevie's point around kind of who we pay attention to, and I think that that's actually one of the primary roles of study, of rigorous study, is also to understand who do we trust, whose kind of ideas and theories and analysis and experience do we trust. I happen to trust Miriam Kaba. I don't know who this other guy is that Stevie was referencing, but I also don't want us to get too caught up on, and I'm not suggesting Stevie was saying this, but I don't want us to get too caught up on, having to be right or having to, only have a handful of people be the trusted messengers. I think that there's room, if we are going to build the kind of mass that we need to build, to actually have some power. There's room for more of us to get in the boat. And I guess I would just ask you, if you're interested in getting in the boat, please come correct. Please do the work to understand what the politics are. Please do the work to get out of your comfort zone. So if community oversight is your jam and people are repeatedly telling you they don't think that we can eliminate police with community oversight, can you think beyond that if you really have this goal? But I do think that there's room for many more of us. And I want our movement to be as vibrant and as exciting and as welcoming as it can be, right? I steal from Tony Capambara all the time, but I'm going to say it again because I think it is important. We need to make our politics irresistible. And that is not, meant to be a slogan or a catchphrase or something. That's meant to be our practice. How do we make this the place people want to be? So that's where I think we're at right now and where we need to be.
Jericho, you want to follow that? I shouldn't have posed it that way. Jericho, would you follow that?
I will try. When Stevie was talking about meeting who he calls kids who are claiming to be abolitionists, but are not actually abolitionists, it actually made me think of Christianity and the type of people who I meet who call themselves Christians, or the type of churches who I hear call themselves Christians. It's always interesting because it's that's not really what, I don't say real Christians, but I don't take a lot of their work, the fruits of their labor, to be Christ-like. I wish people had a similar orientation on abolition because that would be a lot easier, but as someone who is sort of living among those spaces, it reminds me so much of it. So I feel like I'm used to having to contest the term and the politics because of all the practice I've had to do as someone who identifies as a Christian. But what's exciting about contesting those terms is that for lots of people, I'm the only person who's a Christian abolitionist who's anti-capitalist that they know, right? So then when they have someone come up in the church who's talking about, we need more Black police officers, I can say, no, Jesus is anti-police. So it gives us new terrain to wage these conversations. And I hope that, as more people become abolitionists, people who grapple and study the politics continue to push back and contest the term. What book was I reading? I can't remember the name of the book right now, but it was Manny Mirable's book, maybe How Capitalism Underdeveloped America. And he has his 10-point program or not a 10-point program, but he has a list of thoughts at the end of this book. And one of the thoughts says, we don't need to make a bunch of people socialists. we need to make a lot of people excited, or we need to make socialism popular. And so I hear part of what Rachel is saying about abolition. I don't know if our project is to go and evangelize the masses and have a bunch of abolitionist converts, but maybe it could be to popularize and make the politics irresistible. And that's something that's maybe easier than getting into one-on-one arguments with people about whether they are specifically abolitionists. I think that can be important. But I think what's more exciting is that 54% of Americans surveyed said that the police precinct in Minnesota was rightfully burned down after George Floyd's death. Do I think those 54% of people are abolitionists? No. Do I think those 54% of people believe that we should defund the police? No. But do I think that them being excited about a police precinct burning down means something for abolition? Absolutely. So how do we take these societal moments where abolition is popular and push the politics further to the left, rather than just being so concerned about in one-on-one conversations whether someone is an abolitionist or a Christian or a socialist? If that person is doing harmful things in the name of those politics, will they have to be caught in or caught out, whatever movement people are using these days? Because I can't keep up with how we're calling. I think that's important. So I think the contestation is important, but I'm much more excited about the politics becoming popular rather than just the individuals.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself, but I was trying to say, Rukia, you're up.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think Rachel and Jericho really laid out the foundation for what I'm just gonna say is that I think when we continue to talk about study and struggle and abolition, that one thing that stuck with me that Stevie said is that we keep us safe. And it's this concept and this understanding, this deep understanding that I think most folks have. I could be wrong, but I believe most folks have, at least most folks I've talked to. Even if they believe in police, they also believe that we keep us safe. And I think that that is true even inside of the carceral system. It's not the guards inside that protect folks. It's other folks who are incarcerated that protect each other. And when we're out here in the communities, we keep us safe. We create the systems of accountability that we need to see and to prevent harm from happening in the first place. And so as we continue to engage and study, I want us to study how we have kept us safe in the past, and to really engage in those deep conversations that Rachel talked about earlier, that is a part of our political education and our study, to figure out how we began to create new ideas and new ways to experiment with what safety looks like when we're in control of it as community. So that's what I'll leave us on, is this idea that we keep us safe. So.
Thank you, Rukia. So we have a lot of questions, not a lot of time. So my strategy here is I'm going to read a couple of these that I feel like touch on new areas, and then just let you kind of in the same format choose which one you want to respond to. So one of these is, have any of you studied something that was so overwhelming that you felt incapable of action, and how did you overcome that experience? Another one is, how do you respond to people who don't see lived experience as a credible form of knowledge or value? And the last one is a bit longer. The disability community often expresses fear over being left behind by abolitionists, of desire for independent living not being centered as it should be, rather than, quote, being taken care of. As a disabled person myself, I struggle to articulate the difference between community care and being taken care of to other disabled folks. So do any of the speakers have ideas for language and phrasing that would help with that? So Rachel, you can feel free to take any of those.
All right. Those are really interesting questions, all of them. I think I will start with overwhelm, which is to say yes. The answer to that question is yes. I have studied things that have felt overwhelming to me. And, you know, I mean, some of the things that I think are the most important to my political development have seemed overwhelming to me, right? So understanding history of race and racism. You know, I did formal study on that got me so overwhelmed there were some days I couldn't get out of bed. I think learning about, you know, capitalism is overwhelming. And I think understanding each of those things and their relationship to each other, but I'll take them separately, is essential to the politics that I have, but also to me being able to live the kind of life that I want to live. So if I'm committed to living in a way that is not completely under the boot of, you know, some white oppressor, then I need to understand those things. And, you know, that's, I think, the same with learning about, and this isn't, you know, book study, but this is kind of the day-to-day conversation that we've been talking about as a totally legitimate way to learning about the conditions that people are living under in prisons across the United States and being in communication with imprisoned people in many states, as I was for years and years. That is totally overwhelming and makes you not want to act. And I think a kind of political commitment is what keeps me going. And, you know, I think to Derica's point, we develop that political commitment, right? Most of us don't have the luxury, the good fortune, maybe I'll say, of growing up in the Lumumba family, to being kind of like out the womb into radicalism, right? Most of us need to develop that. And, you know, I think having that kind of, I'm not going to say North Star just because I feel like that's getting overused too, and I want to save that for good stuff. But having that kind of pull, that kind of really, really deep pull to want to transform our conditions helps me stay committed. And also, I think, helps me understand that I need to do the work that helps me stay committed. And what that means in my case, and people learn differently, so I'm not sure what works for everyone. But in my case, what that means is breaking things into chunks. That means not trying to understand the entire history of capitalism, you know, overnight or through one class. Or I'm just going to sit down and read Capital by myself, for instance, right? Which I hear lots of people do. They're like, I want to understand capitalism, so I'm going to read Capital, right? But understanding, I think, chunk by chunk, and to give yourself some patience with that too, I think, to understand, like, okay, these are building blocks. I'm going to have to figure out how to put them together in a way that helps me understand the bigger thing, gives you something to move through, and gives you something to grow into. You know, the same with racism, as I was talking about before, right? So I don't need to read every single terrible thing that was ever done to Black people, right? Even though that's kind of the formal academic practice, right? Read all of this literature and then be able to comment on all of this literature. And in that case, all this literature was history of, you know, sociology and anthropology, which has been just remarkably bad to Black people, devastatingly, deathly to Black people. So it's maybe not read all of those things, but it's to say, Okay, let me figure out, and this might be in conversation with somebody who I respect and trust. Let me figure out what's a chunk, what's a good starter chunk that helps me build from there, right? I mean, I think it's the same way in some ways that we think about having, doing abolitionist organizing, right? If we can't get rid of every single prison or every single cop today, which again, I'm never against. If we can do that, let's do that today. But if we can't, then what is a meaningful chunk that moves us further toward the horizon of what we want and doesn't mean that we got to go back and then relearn or re-tear down or whatever the going back would be, right? What gets us one step further toward our goal. And I think that's one way to approach study when it's kind of overwhelming. So that was long-winded, so I'll only respond to that one.
Thank you, Rachel. We're going to let interpretation take a brief pause and then finish with Derica and Rukia.
Are we good to go?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Initially, it was abolition as my so overwhelming. What about the murderers? What about all of that? That was one of my initial things that I felt like it was just too impossible, too large, too unrealistic. All the things I've written about. Since then, there's been so many new ones, and I'm always trying to figure out how to do what Rachel said and to break things down and to learn them with other people and in chunks. The most recent one has been climate change. When people talk about abolition and other people sort of freeze up because it feels overwhelming, I get a deep sense of anxiety when I hear climate change, global warming, climate crisis. And it wasn't until I read The Uninhabitable Earth that I could actually have some sort of grasp of the concept, some sort of grasp on what does 1 degree of warming mean versus 2 degrees versus 3 and then 4. And if it gets to 4, how terrible it is. So the book is very, very sad, but I think it's an explainer. It helped me to understand the nature of the problem. What sorts of interventions we can take to stop it. So reading, asking questions, learning in very, very tiny bite-sized chunks. Because everything you're taught about, at least everything I was taught about climate change and environmentalism, has all just been dismantled. You learn that the plastics industry is behind recycling, and you're just like, what happened to reduce, reuse, recycle? Isn't this what we're supposed to do? And then you learn that, this is actually a way for them to justify to continue making more plastics. None of it has ever stopped producing plastic. So then you have to rethink that you thought that you were progressive on recycling. You've been saving your cereal boxes when actually you have to do way more than that if you're going to try to save the planet. And so climate change has been something I've been really trying to study and develop an analysis around, because it's the planet is going to be abolished if we don't figure out how to save it soon enough. And so I've been trying to take that on. The question around disability, I also is now one of the conversations that I've been trying to definitely learn a lot more, and that started in law school. So when the Movement for Black Lives initially released their policy platform, the journal that I was editor of, we did a call for papers to see how people were using the policy platform in their organizing, their teaching. And in our call for papers, we received a lot of responses that were critiques of the M4BL platform through a disability analysis. And so I was so excited to be able to publish those critiques, because the first time that I read any sort of critique of M4BL in a way that was actually pushing them to be more inclusive, instead of just like a lot of the ridiculous critiques. And since then, M4BL has gone through iterations of improving and updating the policy platform to include that analysis. But it was the first time I was reading about autism and disability and deaf and hard of hearing in relationship to police violence and prison violence. And it was, quite remarkable how though that journal has definitely helped to shape my politics around disability, but it's something I know I still have to learn about and around. And so the fear rather, of the abolitionist movement leaving people who have a disability justice practice or framework behind, one thing I try to think about, who are the people who are disability justice advocates who are in abolitionist spaces, because they're not left behind. They're there. They're there. Groups like her, Harriet Tubman Collective, the people who are currently signing this event, right? Who do you look to? Who you read? Who you turn to? So I was a shameless plug for that journal. It came out in 2017. You can read some of the critiques there, and then you can go read the updated M4BL policy platform to see how it's been incorporated. And hopefully there'll be much more of that. And what was the last question? There was the overwhelm, the disability justice, and what was the third question?
How do you respond to people who don't see lived experience as a credible form of knowledge or value?
How do I respond to people? It depends on the people. Honestly, it depends on the person. Because how do I say this? I am finding that there's not a one size fit all to lots of these conversations, right? So there are some people, for example, who only care about directly impacted people and their lived experiences if it serves their goals of moderate reforms. So they only want you to hear about people who are directly impacted to say, we want community policing, or we want to build several new jails instead of to close them. And so then you have people who care about, people's lived experiences informing the policy or the law or the panel or the book, but it's usually as an attempt to undermine radical, progressive, or abolitionist aims. And so I have much more to say to those people than I do to people who don't value, people's lived experiences. I think maybe I've just been lucky in the last few years where I've seen a political shift to absolutely trying to censor people's lived experiences. Now, I'm not in the funding spaces, and I would be surprised if the money also followed the people with lived experiences. And when it does, I can almost guess that it, again, goes to people who have it's not to the Stevie Wilsons of the world, right? It's not to Mumia. There's no directly impacted conversation around Mumia Abu-Jamal. Right, so it depends on whose lived experiences get centered, and the ones that are most vocal right now, or the people who have opportunities right now to push the conversation. And so I maybe would let Rakia answer that because I'm still formulating a lot of thoughts about it.
Yeah, Rakia, we'll let you. We're over time, so I want to thank our audience for sticking with us, and we'll let Rakia have the last word.
All right, I'll try to be quick. I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer to that question because to be quite honest, I still am working on dealing with my frustration around people who do not really believe in or censor people with lived experience. And so I don't think that I can have an unbiased or a fair response to that right now. Most of the folks I work with have experienced the trauma, the horrific treatment, and just serious, including myself in many ways, outside of the carceral system, but just, state violence. And so I just don't have a really positive response to that right now. And so I'm going to hold off on answering that question. I do, and I recognize that I'm going to grow in that moment, and grow around how to answer that. I will say that in terms of, I do want to just real quickly, I'm sorry, so much I want to respond to when we realized time was out. I literally, it shifts my my mindset a little bit. But one of the things I do want to just lift up is I do want to again lift up the Harriet Tubman Project. I want to lift up HERD. I want to lift up all of those organizations that have really pushed the movement for Black lives, for us to really push a disability justice framework. And also for all of those folks who have really pushed us to also recognize our trans experiences and value and need to ensure that we are also centering trans lives as well. And so, like, I just want to really make sure that I state that, because it's not the movement for Black lives. We're made up of over 150 organizations. So every time we're learning, that means you have 150 other organizations and entity and people that are also learning and experiencing and shifting our politics locally to ensure that we're including conversation around those very, very important siblings of our communities. So, so that's really important. I wanted to mention that. To the first question around, I don't even remember what the first question is anymore. I done got so thrown off.
You're okay. So if you want to end with this one, it's when have you studied something that you were overwhelmed by, and how did you sort of overcome?
Thank you. That was the first question. Okay. Yes. Honestly, studying the law. In law school, studying the law was overwhelming for me because I was so disappointed in U.S. law and policy. Like, the entire system is ridiculous. And how we interpret it, the process of interpretation. Like, when I say I truly felt that I was entering a space of no opportunity to actually find justice and humanity for anyone. Like, I was just blown away. I was shocked. I thought that at least by going to law school, I would somehow open the door to some amazing information that was being used inappropriately. No, the whole system is messed up. Whole philosophy, right? I just was just shocked by that. And so that was overwhelming for me. What gave me hope was actually the things I read outside of law school. It was the conversations I had outside of law school. It was this movement around abolition as a practice that actually gave me hope. And studying other forms of government and other systems of justice that actually gave me hope. And so, that's what was overwhelming for me. And that's how I overcame it too, is our people. So I'll end there. Thank y'all so much. I also want to thank T.L. Lewis, who actually has really, is a disability justice advocate, and Valissa Thompson, who are two disability justice advocates who have really helped me and guided me in my own development around those issues. So I just want to shout them out too.
So thank you to the whole HERD team and everyone on this call. The audience, you can't see all the stuff behind the scenes. There's like 12 people on this call. And I appreciate every single one of them, especially Rachel, Rukia, Derica. Thank you so much I always feel like an interloper getting to spend a couple hours with all of you. So thank you so much for making time and for everyone tuning in.